All right, folks, I'm ready to get started. Welcome back. Welcome back to the eighth week together. So we are pretty much at the halfway point at this point. Maybe a little bit more because really the semester is 16 weeks, but part of that is finals. So the last week is like the 16th week, and that's not really a week. It's kind of a whole other thing. So we are pretty deep into this. Today we will begin to cover we'll top off chapter 7, which we essentially already finished, but we'll top off the 8th chapter. I'm sorry, we'll top off chapter 7, and then we'll start on chapter 8, which is the last chapter of the second part of the course. So we've been developing that framework of costs that reflected a very general production process, all coming from chapter 5. So having established all of that, now we can use that framework to start analyzing optimal decision making by firms in different market settings, ranging in terms of degree of competitiveness from the most competitive a market can be, a perfectly competitive market, to the least competitive a market can be, which is a monopoly. And then the cases in between, which are monopolistic competition, which involves competition, but competition amongst firms that are able to kind of differentiate their products from their competitors, which then allows them to be able to charge a little bit above their own costs. And then the other one is the most common market setting which firms operate in, which is called an oligopoly, which is characterized by large firms that are few in number that dominate and control the market. And that is probably the most interesting case, and it's the most common one, and it's the one that most industries that you all are probably interested in becoming a part of or are consumers in are. They are oligopolies. And so that tends to be the more complicated of the market settings, because there is interdependence in their decision making, meaning that decision making by the firms needs to take into consideration what their rivals are doing. And so because of that, it is, again, the most complicated setting, and it requires more in-depth, sophisticated approaches to sort of analyzing. And that's why that one is left for after this second exam, basically defining half of the last part of the course, with 2 chapters covering the models that help us sort of understand that market setting. So this chapter chapter 8 will cover managing and competitive. So that's the perfectly competitive industries, monopolistic, again, monopolies, and monopolistically competitive markets, which is sort of a hybrid of the two. And I'll talk about the characteristics of all of these settings a little bit more, which is what the end of chapter 7 covers, to kind of introduce us to what we're essentially going to be doing till the end of the course. And then there's a couple more chapters at the end that kind of deal with what firms that have market power, the ability to charge above their marginal costs, what they can do to actually take advantage of that and do to take advantage of it. And that's chapter 11. And then chapter 12 has to do with issues of information, like what happens when the information in the markets is not perfect, as we say, meaning that the participants don't necessarily understand or know exactly everything they need to know in order to make the optimal decisions. And so that's what the final chapter will deal with. So the last part of the course, past this part, is going to be challenging, and that's why I don't make the final cumulative, because it builds on your knowledge of the things that we've already covered up till that point, so that you can try to get a grasp on that final stuff. And then I don't like to make people have to cover everything we covered in the semester, because then you really don't focus on the stuff we cover at the end, and then you really don't wind up learning it that well, which is a disservice to those of you that are interested in actually using this information as foundation for further learning, which it is for a lot. And ultimately, even if it's not meant to, if this class is not meant to sort of provide you foundations for more advanced learning of this stuff. Like it is going to provide you basic intuitions about how firms should operate and be managed in these variety of settings and all the issues related to that. So it is important for you to try to like at least internalize like this information to some extent as sort of like your baseline sort of case that you always compare what's actually happening around you to. Like in the perfect setting that we considered in class, given these certain conditions that we assumed to be the case, this was the result. And in reality, here I am in a firm, blah blah blah, doing things that don't necessarily meet those same conditions, but I can compare the situation to what it could be, and I can then improvise or maybe try to get more information on how I can go about adapting the current situation to what I know could result from just the baseline case that I considered in my managerial economics course. So it's worth your time to kind of try to understand this stuff, and certainly if you did not get a firm grasp on chapter 5 in terms of like how we model production and like what that tells us about costs and the short run and the long run, then you need to try to get that down as soon as possible. For, of course, the second exam, because it's going to be a huge part of it. But also because if you don't really understand that stuff, then you're not really truly going to understand everything we're going to talk about in this chapter, and then everything we're going to talk about beyond that. So you're not really going to get that like intuition that you could get from this course that can provide you like pretty strong foundation for operating within different markets as managers, in whatever capacity you wind up working in these different types of market settings. So try your best is what I'm trying to say. Do your best to try to learn this stuff and actually care. All right, so as far as chapter 8 goes, we're going to cover perfect competition today, the most competitive case of what a market can be. And then we're going to start on monopoly. We won't actually finish monopoly today. And then, as you all know, we have spring break next week. So there's going to be a break in between. And as I've said before, and I hope you kind of have this perspective on it, like it is a great opportunity for you now in the middle of the semester to really like stabilize yourself within the semester. Try to catch up on things you're behind on. Try to get ahead of things that that you know are going to become a problem later on. But B, really to kind of lay like a very clear path for yourself on how to approach the second half of the semester, like how to really take on everything that is coming. You have exams coming, and I'm sure in most of your classes you have a second exam coming, or maybe a third, who knows, beyond the final, and then papers and whatnot right before the final. So there's all sorts of things that are going to start piling up on you, and as is always the case with a semester, and it's kind of like this snowball effect that occurs in those last few weeks, and it kind of just sweeps you up. And unless you have like a solid approach to it, like a solid sort of idea of like, this is how much time I'm going to have, this is what I know is going to happen, and this is how much time I should be dedicating to each thing, over the course of however many weeks you have, then it can become a problem for you. And then you will have too much to do at any given time, which means that you're not going to do a good job on those things. And therefore, you're not going to be able to demonstrate to me and to yourselves and to the university and eventually maybe to potential employers that what you're actually capable of. You're gonna wind up demonstrating crap, and that's going to reflect badly on you. And you have every ability to avoid that now by just, again, taking full control of the situation. I'm not saying don't enjoy your spring break, because you should. Take a little bit of time to do what you do to enjoy your life. But beyond that, like, it is the time to really just buckle down and just get like a solid plan going for the second half of the semester, so that things can work out. You can walk away feeling really good about your performance in this class, your performance in your other courses, whatever else you're doing, so that the summer winds up being like a time of sort of like celebration and like positive reflection. Feeling proud of what you did, using the knowledge of what you learned in the classes plus what you learned about yourself, pushing yourselves to kind of think about like where you can go from there, like how you can move forward past the summer to even bigger successes versus doing crappy now, regretting it later, and then just all summer feeling bad about it, like just and then thinking, oh, okay, well, I need to change. Eventually, I'll change, and always kind of pushing that change off. So again, it's this kind of weird domino thing that happens, and if you take the right steps now, then all that can lead to some really good results. But if you don't, it can lead to some really bad results for you. Ultimately, psychologically, it will hurt you. You will feel bad about it. So don't let that happen. Like really put a lot into everything you're doing now while you're still in school. Spring break, you're still in school. Even though it's technically a break, it's not. You're still in school. So be in school during that time. Get things done. And then you'll feel really good about everything towards the end. As far as this class goes, chapter 7 and 8, chapter 6 and 7, the mini papers, as you know, I made them due at the end of spring break. So for those of you looking to knock out the paper, this is an opportunity for you. You can write mini papers on 6 and 7 and an open chapter mini paper submission on some other chapter we've covered already. That's 3 chapters, 3 mini papers. That's your paper. I mean, yeah, you got to write an introduction and a conclusion later on, but like that's your paper. So you could really knock your paper out right now and just avoid, again, being put into that situation where you've left it to the last moment. You're writing crap, and you're going to get a crappy grade as a result. Like that's not what you want. You have every opportunity now to avoid that, so avoid it. Like I said, chapter 6 and 7 are pretty good chapters to kind of just use the ideas to sort of frame an argument or an analysis or something related to the case that you've chosen that will help to explain the case or maybe provide insights into how the firm can operate better given the circumstances they're facing, etc. Whatever it is that you choose to do, those 2 chapters are really good because they're less abstract than some of the other stuff we've covered. Again, chapter 6 has to do with so chapter 5 was like costs in the short run, long run, reflecting production. So all that stuff is very technical. It's very much oriented to the like sort of the basic assumptions and components of the models that we use to analyze optimal decision making in these markets. So again, it's just sort of the foundation for what we're doing here. But then chapter 6 was basically just talking about like how does a firm go about like getting their inputs at a minimum cost? Well, they could buy them in spot exchanges, just exchanging money for goods without establishing long-term contracts. But if there's a lot of transaction costs in the form of specialized investments, which result in relationship-specific exchanges, then they might want to go an alternate route. They might just want to set up a contract with a supplier. And then we talked about the complexities of a contract and how depending on the complexity of the contracting environment or the standardized nature of the input that's being purchased, contracts can either be longer or shorter, and the longer they are, the more expensive they get, the less likely they'll be to cover every possible outcome, every contingency. And so if that is the case and it just becomes too expensive to write a contract, then the firm should vertically integrate the production of the input they need into their production process. So that it was like a basic sort of like kind of common sense approach to kind of thinking about very practical issues that again translate really easily into like arguments in papers. So and then there was also the last part of that chapter, which had to do with solving the principal agent problem. How do the owners of firms align their interests with the managers of firms? How do the managers of firms align their interests with workers? Maybe you'll encounter some issues related to this concept in your case. If so, you can write a paper on it using some of the concepts that we use in class. that are in the chapter to elucidate some issues um, that may require it. Who knows? There's a lot of ways to apply stuff from that chapter. Last chapter, nature of industry, had to do with sort of gauging the competitiveness of a market via the market structure part of the chapter, in which we looked at different concentration measures that told us how concentrated markets were, meaning um, like like the amount of the overall sales in the market shares, like is that in a few hands, is that in a lot of hands? If it's in a few hands, then obviously the markets are less competitive. If it's in a lot of hands, the markets are more competitive. And then we looked at the performance. We looked at the conduct of firms in potentially different market structure settings. And we looked at like how pricing can be affected via the markups. The learner index gave us some information about that. We looked at the demand conditions and the relationship between elasticity of overall industry output to the elasticity of the individual firm output. And then finally, in the last part, we looked at performance, which is like how are these market settings behaving with respect to their profits and with respect to like social welfare. So just really broad issues were covered in that chapter as well, having to do with just like the industries that firms can operate in, which again can be used to kind of like just talk about like the firms you're talking about in your cases, which can be related to the which can be related to any one of these concepts that we covered that were very general, that were basically just meant to kind of provide insights into like big characteristics of industries. Before we start talking about the specific characteristics of particular industries in Chapter 8 and moving forward. So and from this point forward, it'll all be very specific, and it'll be very much focused on like the models and what they can tell us about, optimal firm behavior, which again reflects optimal management approaches. So again, perfect opportunity for you to knock out the paper during the break. Try to do so if you haven't already done so. If you've already written a couple of papers, finish it off. Again, don't let the paper become a hindrance to you, because it's probably the easiest component of the grade, besides the communication grade and the homework. And ultimately, if you manage all those things in the way that you should, then the only real challenge is what the course is ultimately all about, which is the material. And if you're not doing too hot on the exam, like if you didn't do too hot in the last exam, and things don't go too well in the second exam, like you need that extra buffer to kind of carry you through. But in the end, like I've said from the beginning, like if you're not passing the exams, you cannot pass the course. So if you don't pass all 3 exams, you cannot pass the course. So that's also important to note. But if you are not writing your paper, then that's going to leave a big dent in your overall grade, mini papers included. And again, homework, communication will do the same. So you got to take care of all those things, but those things will not define your grade. What will define your grade is your actual ability to understand what's being covered in the class, and being able to demonstrate that understanding by actually passing the exams and doing well on them. So keep that in mind. Again, middle of the semester, but definitely a perfect time to kind of reflect on what's happened and what's going to happen, and sort of adjust your approach if necessary. I know a lot of you don't need an adjustment in your approach. I know a lot of you are doing well, and certainly the people that I see here on a regular basis, you're obviously committed to doing well here. So you don't really need to hear any of this really, and you would probably get an A in this course even if I wasn't here. So good. I'm glad you're here, and keep up the good work. And just remember, everybody, I'm talking to everybody in the course, not just people sitting in the room. So I'm addressing everybody, even the people that aren't here. And the people that aren't here, even though there are a few that are, they are on top of things in a very precise way, doing excellently in the course. A lot of them aren't. And so if that's one of you, if you're one of these people, you might want to change your overall approach. It might be a benefit to you to come to class. But whatever, it's up to you. It doesn't matter to me, as long as in the end, you make this work out for yourselves. I'm doing my part, what I'm supposed to do, and the rest is up to you. I I hope you do your part, and I hope you do it well. Are there any questions about anything you'd like me to address before I move forward with the material? Alrighty, then let us again just cap off chapter 7 by talking about these four market settings that we're going to be focusing on. So the first one is the perfect competition market setting. It is as competitive a market as a market can get. So a market is characterized by perfect competition. There are many firms, each of which is small relative to the entire market. So you have just a bunch of firms that are competing against each other. Nobody has a size advantage. The firms have access to the same technologies and produce similar products. So what they need to produce is available to everybody. So there aren't certain technologies that are difficult to get because of like patents, etc. Like everything you need to produce in these industries is available to anybody, and therefore, anybody that wants to get into the industry can get into these industries. There are no what are called barriers to entry. Firms in perfectly competitive market do not have market power. They do not have the ability to charge above their marginal cost. So as far as the Lerner index goes, the Lerner index is equal to 1, which means that the markup is equal to 1, which means that the so it's price minus, no, I'm sorry, it's equal to 0. The Lerner index is equal to 0. It's price minus marginal cost over the price. And the price equals marginal cost in perfectly competitive industry. So Lerner index is equal to 0. The markup is 1 over 1 minus the Lerner index. So 1 over 1 minus 0 is equal to 1, which means that price equals marginal cost. So they don't mark up their prices. They sell exactly at the cost of producing. And if they try to do any different, they get priced out of the market because they have so many other competitors. There are as many firms as can operate in those markets. No firm can have any kind of advantage, and if they try, they fail. So both concentration ratios, the C4 ratio and the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, tend to be close to 0. So the C4, again, was the market shares of the 4 largest firms in perfectly competitive markets. All firms are very small relative to each other, and so their market shares are very small relative to the entire market, the total amount of sales in those markets. And so, even if you get the amount of sales of the 4 biggest firms as a fraction of all the sales in those industries, it's going to be tiny. So the C4 concentration ratio will be tiny. The Herfindahl-Hirschman index is the sum of the market shares squared of the firms in the industry, multiplied by 10,000, and those market shares are really small. So you have a bunch of numbers that are really small, they're squared, add them together, you're going to get a small number. So that's what they mean by both concentration ratios, the C4 and the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, really small numbers, again reflecting the fact that there are no large firms kind of like just hogging like a lot of the sales in the industries. Everybody's kind of like on equal footing as far as how much they're selling relative to each other. Rothschild index, the ratio of the elasticity of the industry to the elasticity of the individual firm, tends to be close to 0 because we say that in perfectly competitive markets, their demand is perfectly elastic. So the sensitivity of consumers to changes in prices is as much as it possibly can be. There's so many, and that's always dependent on how many substitutes there are available. And there's so many substitutes available for the things that are being sold, which are generally commodities, very generic goods, that if even a firm tries to raise their price by even a penny, then their quantity demanded goes down to 0 because any slight change in price means that they're just going to have a slightly higher price than everybody else, and therefore it won't be of any value to a person to actually buy the good at a higher price than an infinite amount of other sellers is willing to sell the same good at. Generally, the thing that's being sold is like as general the good as possible. Agricultural goods tend to be sold in perfectly competitive markets. Oil, not gasoline, but oil itself, what's pumped out of the ground. Um, a lot of kind of like those bare bones sort of elements that are gotten from the earth that are then used to produce other things like iron ore, just wood, like from trees, etc. Like the things that are like really easy to get. That once you have them, you can't really do anything special with them. Like you can't make your own version of like wheat. Like wheat is wheat. Like there's nothing you can do with that. You can eventually use it to turn it into unique products, and that does, of course, happen. And the products wind up being part of, different type of markets than the perfectly competitive one. But in general, when you're talking about like these bare bones sort of goods that we call commodities, that nobody can really like make the sexy version of, like in those cases, like you're going to have those goods being sold in perfectly competitive markets. Um, the money market that you guys were introduced to in your macro courses, the liquidity preference model that has to do with money demand and money supply, that's considered a perfectly competitive market. Money is considered a good that is just very generic and you can't really do anything special with. So the market you saw there was a perfectly competitive market. At the other end of the spectrum is the monopoly market setting, in which only one firm basically defines the entire market. So a monopoly is a firm that is the sole producer of a good or service in a relevant market. There's a tendency for the seller to capitalize on the monopoly position by restricting output and charging a price above marginal cost. So because the one firm defines the market, they can do whatever they want within the market as far as like their pricing and as far as how much output they're willing to put out. And so they do, to the extent that they maximize their profits to the greatest extent possible in their market that they operate in. So we'll see how that works partly today, but more on when we get back from the spring break. But yeah, so the firms, the one firm that dominates the market, it basically is the one that like defines the industry. And so when we're talking about like the concentration measures that I talked about, the C4 and the Herfindahl-Hirschman index from the last chapter we covered. Oh, well, this chapter is still part of chapter 7. So in this chapter, you have one firm. The C4 is again the sum of the market shares of the 4 largest firms. And so if there's only one firm, then its market share is equal to 1. Therefore, the C4 will be equal to 1. As far as the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, again, the sum of the squared market shares times 10,000. So one firm, 1 squared times 10,000. You get a 10,000 result for the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. Is as bad as it can be as far as like measuring how concentrated the market is. It's basically perfectly concentrated when it comes to a monopoly. And then the Rothschild index, again, the ratio of the elasticity of the industry to the elasticity of the individual firm. The industry is the firm, and so therefore they will have the same elasticity. So it'll be the same number divided by the same number, which equals 1. So the Rothschild index will be unity, which means that it's equal to 1. All right, so the next setting is kind of like a hybrid of monopoly and monopolistic competition and perfect competition. It's called monopolistic competition. In a market characterized by monopolistic competition, there are many firms and consumers, just like in perfect competition. Concentration measures are close to 0 because, again, there are no firms that really dominate these markets. Unlike perfect competition, each firm produces a product that is slightly different from the products produced by other firms. And so Rothschild indexes are greater than 0. So you have the elasticity of the entire industry divided by a number that's not going to be infinity, which is what the elasticity in a perfectly competitive market is. But it is going to be big. And so you're going to have a number divided by a big number, so you're going to have a really small Rothschild index. So this kind of market, essentially, a lot of the goods that you guys buy do have characteristics of monopolistically competitive industries. The easiest example is just like hamburgers. So, Burger King, McDonald's, they sell burgers. Burgers are burgers. Um, you know, bread, meat, lettuce, tomato, onions. You have a burger. McDonald's calls theirs a Big Mac. Burger King calls theirs a Whopper. They brand them. They kind of give them their own identity because advertising can be very effective in doing that. And because of that, people then don't think of the Whopper or the Big Mac as burgers. They think of them as the Big Mac, which then kind of creates its own sort of sub-market within the burger industry that is just for that type of burger, like Burger King does with their Whopper. And so you get customers that are loyal to those particular versions of something that is very generic, a burger. And so because of that, they're willing to pay a little bit more. And so these firms tend to have some market power, meaning they have some ability to charge above their marginal cost, which again is not possible in a perfectly competitive industry and is the main characteristic of a monopoly. And so that's why this is kind of like a hybrid of the two. And we'll definitely talk more about this one 2 weeks from today when we meet for the final time before the second exam. So the firm has some control over the price charged for the product in these industries. Firms in monopolistically competitive industries often spend considerable sums on advertising in an attempt to convince consumers that their brands are better than other brands. And then finally, the most common setting is the oligopoly. In an oligopolistic market, there's a few firms that tend to dominate the market. The firms tend to be large. The amount of firms that sort of define oligopoly will range. It could be anywhere from 2 to 8, maybe a little bit more. And yeah, there's no like standard number range for it. It just depends on the industry. Firms in highly concentrated industries such as airline, automobile, aerospace industries operate in oligopolistic markets. So again, like a lot of the industries you're familiar with will tend to be oligopolistic, and it tends to be very common, and therefore the insights that we can gain from the models we have that try to explain how to best maneuver these markets are important. They have a lot of practical value and can help firms that are in these situations that are complicated, that can be puzzles as far as like how to best maneuver them, how to best optimize profits, etc. And so again, that's why we have multiple models to try to deal with these markets, and why we have 2 different chapters worth of material to cover that address issues related to this market, which again will happen post the second exam. And the distinguishing feature of an oligopolistic market is mutual interdependence amongst firms in the industry, meaning that they have to take into consideration what their rivals are doing. They can't just think about their own cost conditions and maybe like what the demand looks like in the market, reflecting the behavior of consumers. They have to also think about what are their rivals doing? Like, are their rivals charging different prices? Or how much output are their rivals producing? Because they share the market. And so they share a demand curve. And so anyone changing their output in those markets is going to move the entire industry along the demand curve, which means that prices need to change for everybody. But if you're not aware of what your rival's doing and they are affecting the price, then they can price you out of the market. So you have to always be aware of what your rivals are doing in those type of industries. Again, characterized by mutual interdependence, making it complicated, making it, again, an important subject for this course and economics in general, and thus, again, requiring more material to try to sort of explain it and provide some valuable insights into it. So again, that's what we'll cover post the second exam. So again, Chapter 8 is the last chapter we're covering, and it's long enough that we'll start covering it today, won't finish. We'll finish covering it 2 weeks from today. And then what will also happen 2 weeks from today is the second half of that day, I will have to begin teaching Chapter 9, which will begin covering the next part of the course before you take the second exam. So just something to be aware of. It's just because of the nature of this class and how it's structured. Normally, I would give the exam like that same week, but I can't do that with you guys. I'm not going to give you an exam on stuff I just covered that day, obviously. So I have to start covering the next chapter post chapter 8 that same day. So something to keep in mind. Not too serious, of course. Once we take the second exam, I'll like review the stuff we've covered already before we jump into the rest of that chapter. So just something to keep in mind. I need to bring it up. And it's not exactly what it says in the syllabus either. So I have to I just wanted to throw it out there. All right. So, and then one other thing is that I do plan on taking a day off in April, and I'll let you know when that is. I think it might be April 18th. We'll be taking that whole day off. So that's going to happen. But I'll remind you guys about that, and of course, everything will be planned so that it works well around it. All right, so let's talk about perfect competition. The first market setting we're considering here, again, we're going to cover all issues related to this today, and then we will jump into monopoly after the break, and then we won't finish that until next week, and then next week we'll finish monopoly, and then we'll cover monopolistic competition. All right, so the key conditions for perfect competition are that there are many buyers and sellers in the market, each of which is small relative to the market. So it's not just the firms that are large in number that operate in these industries, but there's a lot of demand as well. So you have a lot of consumers that are competing against each other for the goods as well, and therefore individual buyers don't have leverage either over the sellers, so they can't really affect prices either. So firms can't affect prices. Firms are what are called price takers. They just kind of accept the market price that's given in the market, and then they operate based on that and how that interacts with their cost structure. And then consumers are also price takers. They just kind of, again, take the price. They can't affect it, even if they decide I'm going to buy, 1 million units of whatever's being sold. Like even at that magnitude, they still won't be able to affect it because there's a lot more being sold in the industry than what they are buying. Each firm in the market produces the same type of product. It's identical. So consumers view all the products of all firms in the market as perfect substitutes. So there's no difference in what's being sold from one seller to another. So consumers just know that, and they don't, try to seek out, different versions of what's being sold. They just basically go for the seller with the best price, and everybody has the same price, because if they don't, they will be competed out of the market. They'll be priced out of the market. So buyers and sellers also have perfect information. Everybody knows that there's a bunch of people buying, there's a bunch of people selling, that everybody that's selling is selling the exact same thing, that everybody that's selling is selling at the exact same thing at a very specific price. None of this is difficult to know in these markets. It's common knowledge, and so everybody behaves the way you expect them to behave in these markets, as opposed to there being like some firms that think, oh, well, I'm just going to charge a higher price, and that's not going to affect anything. No, they know exactly what they should charge, and they know what will happen if they do not charge that price. They know that they will not be able to compete in those markets. There's no transaction cost. So when people are buying the goods in these markets, there's no specialized investments like we talked about, dedicated assets, site specificity, all those things we discussed in chapter 6. None of that exists with respect to buying the goods in these markets. And lastly, and probably most important, is that there is free entry and exit from the market. So there's not what are called barriers to entry. The firms are able to enter the market if there are profits to be made, and exit the market if there are losses being made. But of course, they can't enter or exit until they're in the long run. So free entry and exit occurs in the long run, which implies that firms operate in a perfectly competitive market, earning zero economic profits. So even if in the short run there are economic profits to be made, in the long run, firms will enter the market. They will erode those profits by increasing supply, which lowers the market price, which will get it to a point where it will eventually equal the cost of producing, which will lead to zero economic profits. But remember, when we're talking about zero economic profits, we're talking about positive accounting profits, because zero economic profits means that we're subtracting from revenues both explicit and implicit costs. So the explicit costs are just your standard costs that require you paying money, that are normally taken into account in an accounting spreadsheet. But then there's the implicit costs, like what are you giving up by not using the resources you're using to produce to maybe just get some kind of basic return in markets. So then that's taken into consideration as well when we're talking about the profits that we discuss in this course, which are the relevant profits. And so when we mean they're making zero economic profits, means that they're at least making that return that they could be making if they were just invested in some really safe bond, like a government bond or something. All right, let's talk about demand at the market and the firm level. So when we were discussing the basic market model, demand, supply, interacting, setting an equilibrium price and quantity, that was actually a market model of a perfectly competitive industry. We didn't talk about it that way because it's the most basic framework that's used to kind of provide intuition into how basic markets operate and how prices and quantities are affected by the different forces that affect supply and demand. But ultimately, those are perfectly competitive markets that we were looking at. And so that upward sloping supply curve and the downward sloping demand curve represented all of the participants in these markets, of which there are many. But of course, within these very populated markets, there are individual firms that operate, and so they have a perspective on the market, and they have to kind of react to what they see in the market and the limitations that are placed upon them as a result. And so the demand of an individual firm is not the demand that we see in the market. It's not that downward sloping demand curve that helped us to get to those equilibriums that we talked about. So in a competitive market, price is determined by the intersection of the market supply and the demand curves. So again, here's our downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply, and it establishes an equilibrium price and quantity for the market. This is the perspective of the market from the individual firm here on the right. So the figure illustrates the distinction between the market demand curve and the demand curve that the perfectly competitive firm faces. So again, demand, supply, establish an equilibrium price. That's the price that everybody's going to charge in the market. And so for the individual firm, their demand is just based on that price. They cannot charge a different price. And so therefore their demand curve is that price. It's a flat horizontal demand curve. It's perfectly elastic. So remember we talked about elasticities and how they can be represented in the steepness of the curves. So a vertical curve represented inelasticity and a horizontal represented perfect elasticity, and then the cases in between varied obviously. But the flatter the curve was, the more elastic demand was, meaning the more sensitive consumers were to changes in price. This is a perfectly elastic case where consumers are as sensitive as possible to changes in price. So that's, again, capturing all the main characteristics of the perfectly competitive market by having the firm face this horizontal demand curve, which is set at the equilibrium price, which is what that PE represents. So from the individual firm's point of view, the firm can sell as much as it wants at the market price of PE. Again, it is a price taker. It cannot affect the price, but it can sell as much as it wants at that price. So now the question is how much should it sell? So now we use the framework that we always use in economics to answer how much decisions, and that is marginal analysis. And so we talked about marginal analysis at the beginning of the course. So it's about looking at marginal benefit versus marginal cost. We looked at cost curves in Chapter 5, which reflected production. In there, we derived the marginal cost as the derivative of the total cost curve, marginal cost being the extra cost of producing additional units. So we need to compare that against the marginal benefit of selling additional units, Well, the marginal benefit of selling additional units is the extra amount of revenue that firms can gain from selling additional units in a market. So we're going to use that information compared with the marginal cost to establish the optimal output that the firms should supply in these perfectly competitive industries. So the point, obviously, of all firms is to maximize their profits, because that's how firms are valued. That's how they're priced. They're priced on the present discounted value of their net income stream, and so it's all about maximizing their profits in order to maximize the value of the firms. So profit is the difference between revenue and costs. Revenue is price times quantity, the price that a good can be sold at times the amount that's being sold. We know that for an individual firm, the price is always going to be the same for these firms that operate in perfectly competitive markets, and so the price here. This is our total revenue curve, with total revenue being on the y-axis and output quantity being on the x-axis. So the revenue curve is just a line here because the price is not changing. The extra revenue gained by selling additional units, what we call the marginal revenue, is not changing. The marginal revenue is the price. Marginal anything is usually going to be the derivative of the parent curve, in this case revenue. So the slope of this curve, which is marginal revenue, which again represents the additional amount of money that a firm can gain by selling additional units, which equals the price for a perfectly competitive firm, is not changing. It's constant, and therefore the revenue curve is a straight line. The equation for revenue is the price times the quantity. Since each unit of output can be sold at the market price, each unit adds exactly P dollars to revenue. And therefore, this is a linear relation between revenues and the output of for a competitive firm. So again, marginal revenue is the change in revenue attributable to the last unit of output sold. Geometrically, it's the slope of the revenue curve. So again, it's just the change in x, the change in y over the change in x. In this case, change in x would be maybe 1 unit. And the question is, how much does that affect revenues? Well, selling an additional unit will change revenues by the price that it's being sold at, which is not changing. And therefore, the marginal revenue is equal to price. So in economic terms, the marginal revenue for a competitive firm is the market price. In mathematical terms, marginal revenue is the derivative or the slope of the revenue curve. So this is just a general relationship between revenue and quantity. That's our revenue. R is a function of Q. The derivative is marginal revenue, the change in revenue with respect to the change in quantity. Getting us to the principle for the competitive firm's demand. The demand curve for a perfectly competitive firm's product is the horizontal line at the market price. This price is a competitive firm's marginal revenue, and therefore the demand curve, that horizontal line that the firm faces in these markets, is also their marginal revenue curve. So the demand curve equals the price at the market equilibrium, and it equals marginal revenue as well. For perfectly competitive firms, revenue is, of course, price times quantity, where P is the market equilibrium price. Thus, the marginal revenue, the derivative of this with respect to quantity. So again, quantity raised to the power of 1, multiply the whole thing by 1, subtract 1 from 1, that's Q raised to the power of 0, which is equal to 1, which you're left with P. So the derivative of this with respect to Q is equal to P. Again, marginal revenue is equal to price. I'm going to repeat this a lot because I really want to drive home like this concept, because it's really important, like for you to just like kind of get this now, because this is like a very important characteristic of these industries, but it also provides you sort of a benchmark case to compare the other cases against. So you really need to get this down to really understand what we're doing moving forward. All right, so now we can throw in our cost curve. So this is our cost curve from chapter 5. The profits of a perfectly competitive firm are the difference between revenue and cost. So here's our cost function. Again, it's shaped the way it is because of the assumptions we made about production. We assume that initially the firms You know, they benefit from specialization, from hiring additional people dividing up the tasks, then becoming more efficient at producing, which means that the marginal product of production is increasing initially. They have increasing returns to labor initially, and because of that, the marginal cost, the extra cost of producing additional units, is going down initially, and that's why the curve is kind of flattening out initially. That's what it's reflecting, the increasing returns to labor. But then, due to the short run limitation, the fact that, again, a firm is in the short run because they're locked into a certain amount of capital, like their machinery, like the factory they're in, they can't get out of their lease, whatever, but they want to increase their output, so they do. The only way to do that is to hire more people. They hire more people, but the people start to not have enough space to work in, not have enough machines to work with, and therefore they produce additional output, but at a decreasing rate, meaning each additional person produces less than the last person. The marginal product starts to decrease or diminish, which means that the marginal cost of producing will start to increase. The extra cost of producing additional units will start to increase, which is the slope of the cost curve. And so we see that the curve then starts to increase along this range here. So we see that over this range, up until they cross here, that costs obviously exceed revenue. So that's definitely not a profitable range to operate in. Beyond that point, revenue exceeds costs, and therefore that is the profitable range. That's where profits can be made. But at some point, the diminishing returns to labor, the decreasing returns, start to erode the possibility of profits once the cost curve is greater than the revenue curve. So profit, again, in economics, represented by pi, is equal to the difference between revenue, price times quantity, minus the cost of producing a certain quantity, Q. So again, the difference between these curves represents profit. It's negative along these ranges and positive in this center area. Geometrically, based on what we're seeing on the graph, profits are given by the vertical distance between the cost function and the revenue line, as I mentioned. The profit maximizing level of output, the amount of output that's going to maximize the distance between these two, is the level at which the vertical distance between the revenue line and the cost curve is at its greatest. So at the point where these two curves are furthest apart from each other, that's the profit maximizing level of output. Whatever level of output corresponds to that point is the profit maximizing level of output. So in this case, it's going to be Q star. So we're just assuming it's this amount here. Now, what happens at that point is that the slope of our cost curve happens to be exactly equal to the slope of our revenue curve. So the slope of the cost curve at the profit maximizing level of output, point E, is exactly equal to the slope of the revenue line. Recall again that the slope of the cost curve is marginal cost, and therefore at the profit maximizing level of output, the derivative of our cost function, the marginal cost, dc dq, marginal cost, derivative of our cost function, the marginal cost will be equal to marginal revenue. So the profit maximizing output is the output at which marginal revenue equals marginal cost. And in this case, it happens at point E, that meaning that at that point, the slope of the, remember we talked about calculus and what the derivative is. So the slope of the limit of those secant lines as we approach point E approaches the slope of the revenue line, which is the price. So at point E, they're exactly equal. Since marginal revenue is equal to the market price for a perfectly competitive firm, the manager must equate the market price with marginal cost to maximize profits. So that is the profit maximizing rule for the perfectly competitive firm. They set their marginal cost equal to price, which equals marginal revenue. So marginal cost, the derivative of our cost function, is going to equal marginal revenue at the profit maximizing level, which will equal the price. Therefore, marginal cost will equal price. And that will be the rule that they follow to be able to find this amount Q star, which again will maximize their profits, which is what they're looking to do. An alternative way to express a competitive output rule can be depicted with standard, average, and marginal cost curves. So here's some of the cost curves that we looked at in chapter 5. Here's our swoosh-shaped marginal cost curve, kind of like the Nike swoosh shape. It decreases first and then increases. Again, decreases because we have increasing returns to labor initially. Marginal product is increasing as more laborers are hired. But then at the minimum of marginal cost, that's when the change happens. That's when the firm hits that short run wall where they just don't have enough space to go around, don't have enough factory materials to produce as efficiently as before, and they start having those decreasing returns. So that causes marginal cost to start increasing. Here's our average total cost, the average cost of producing at any given level of output. And it has that U shape that, again, has its bottom, its minimum at the point where marginal cost crosses it. Two forces are acting on average total cost, bringing it down. One, well, it's made up of, as we know, total costs are made up of fixed cost plus variable cost, right? The cost of the fixed input plus the cost of the variable input. And so if you take the average of those, you get average fixed cost, you get average variable cost. Add them together, you get average total cost. So average total cost has those two main components, average fixed cost and average variable cost. Fixed costs, in the short run, the firm is not changing the amount of capital they are in the short run. And so that is not changing that number. You divide that by Q to get the average fixed cost. As the firm gets bigger and bigger, produces more and more, then that number gets smaller and smaller and smaller forever. There's a spreading effect of those fixed costs. And that is always working to bring down the average cost of production, the average total cost of production. But we know that average total cost is also made up of average variable cost. Average variable cost initially is decreasing because of increasing returns, and even decreasing after the point where because of increasing returns to labor, But even when decreasing returns begin to bring up marginal costs, average variable costs, which we don't see here right now, will still continue to go down for a range, but eventually it will start to be pulled up because of diminishing returns to labor. And so then you'll start having that countervailing effect where you have the average fixed costs driving to bring down average total costs as the firm gets bigger, but you'll have the average variable cost trying to pull up the average total cost because of diminishing returns. Eventually, that becomes the dominant force, and that does start to pull up average total cost. That happens at the point where marginal cost crosses it, and that's when, again, average total cost starts to increase. Eventually, it always happens. The firm, therefore, has a U-shaped average total cost curve. So that's what we're seeing there. All right, so there's our marginal cost and there's our average total cost. Let's bring in the marginal revenue curve, which is the firm's perspective on the market, which is the perfectly elastic, flat demand curve, which is set at the equilibrium price in the market. So price equals marginal revenue equals the demand for the firm. If the market price is given by PE, this price intersects the marginal cost curve at an output of Q star. So this is the point where the marginal revenue equals marginal cost, which will dictate, once again, the optimal amount of output to produce in the market. That's the profit maximizing level of output at the point where the demand curve hits the marginal cost curve. That's the optimal amount. Any point below that, before that, along the increasing range of marginal cost, any point before that, the marginal revenue, the benefit from selling additional units will outweigh the cost of additional units, the marginal cost, and therefore it will make sense for the firm to continue producing. But beyond that point, the extra cost incurred in producing additional units will be greater than the benefit of selling additional units, and therefore it won't make sense for the firm to go any further than that point. And so that is the point where the firm stops. That is the point where, again, the firm is producing at the level that's maximizing their profits. But it has to be over the increasing range of marginal cost, because marginal cost would be like higher up over this range here. And so you will get a point where marginal cost and marginal revenue will be equal over here as well. But obviously that's over the range where you have increasing returns. And so the firm knows that if they hire more people, that they're going to benefit from that. And so marginal costs will decrease. And so therefore, they don't consider that the point where they stop their output. They continue over the range where marginal cost is increasing to this point where marginal cost equals marginal revenue. So Q star represents the profit maximizing level of output for the firm. All right, so this is where the average total cost comes into play. So now that the firm has chosen its optimal amount, it wants to figure out, well, how much am I going to make at that amount? Well, it needs to figure out on average at that amount how much it costs to produce. And it can figure that out by looking at its average total cost at that level of output. So at the profit maximizing level of output, the average cost of producing each unit is ATC Q star. So that's the average cost of producing each additional unit at Q star. This is how much they're getting from producing each additional unit and selling it. They're getting the equilibrium price, the marginal revenue. So the difference between that price and the average total cost represents profit for the firm. For the one unit, multiply that by Q, you get that rectangle, which represents the profit for the firm in this very specific example, where the firm, again, is setting their optimal level of output at the point where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. So the shaded area of the rectangle is given by its base, which is Q star, times the height, the difference between the price and the average total cost of producing at that optimal quantity. So the base times the height is the rectangle, which we see geometrically represented as profits. So remember that average total cost is equal to total cost divided by quantity. So the total cost of producing Q star divided by the amount produced, which is Q star. The area of the shaded triangle, therefore, is Q star times the difference between the price and the average total cost. If we multiply through here, we'll get Q star times PE, which is the revenue, and then multiply Q star by this term here. The Q's drop out, and then you have the cost of producing that amount of Q star. So once again, it gets us back to your standard profit expression. Profit is equal to revenue minus the cost of producing a certain amount, which in this case is the profit maximizing level of output. So it's just different ways of expressing the same thing. The fact that, again, the firm is doing the best it can in this market, and this is what they're benefiting from the market. They're benefiting in these profits that we see represented geometrically as that rectangle. Getting us to the principle, the competitive output rule. To maximize profits, a perfectly competitive firm produces the output at which price equals marginal cost in the range over which marginal cost is increasing. All right, so mathematically, the profits of a perfectly competitive firm are, of course, revenue minus the cost. The first order condition, the first derivative for maximizing profits requires that marginal profits be zero. Remember, anytime you want to get a maximum or a minimum to any kind of mathematical relationship, you take the derivative, you set it equal to zero, and that's going to get you the quantity that's either going to maximize or minimize the relationship depending on the type of relationship we're looking at. Here, we're looking at a concave relationship that's going to have a maximum, and so you would take the derivative of this, set it equal to zero to figure out what is the value that will maximize profits. Taking the derivative of this with respect to quantity, you're going to have the derivative of this, which is going to equal P, and the derivative of this, which equals marginal cost. So then you have P minus marginal cost equals zero. We can move this term around to the right side, and we can obtain, again, the profit maximizing rule for a firm in perfect competition. So adding this term to both sides gets us to, again, the profit maximizing condition. For the firm to maximize its profits, it has to set its price equal to marginal cost. So there's different ways of getting to the same result here. Graphically, different ways, mathematically. However you choose to sort of remember it, there's different ways to do so. In the end, it's really important you do understand that this is a rule that perfectly competitive firms use to maximize their profits, because it's going to be different than what like a monopolist uses and other types of firms in other types of market settings. Demonstration problem. The cost function for a firm is given by 5 plus q squared. What does q squared here represent? Of this cost function. It's the variable cost, right? It's the variable cost. It's just the component of cost that vary with the amount of output. So what is the 5? It's the fixed cost of production, right? So if the firm sells output in a perfectly competitive market and other firms in the industry sell output at a price of $20, what price should the manager of this firm put on the product? The firm is operating in a perfectly competitive market. Everybody's selling at $20. What should the firm do in terms of pricing? They should price at $20. They are price takers. They cannot change the price. They have to take the prices being given in the market. They have to charge that price. So yeah, they're going to do that. What level of output should be produced to maximize profits, and how much will those profits be? So that's what we just talked about, how they should charge $20. Now let's look at the level at which the firm should sell, how much output they should sell. What is the marginal revenue here? It's $20, which equals the price, right? So what are they going to set that equal to figure out their optimal amount? Their marginal cost. What is the marginal cost here? It's 2Q. It's 2Q. It's a derivative of our cost function. That's what marginal cost is, right? So we need to set our price equal to marginal cost. Price is $20. Marginal cost is equal to 2Q. So now we just solve for Q, which is simple. Divide both sides by 2, obviously, and that gets us to the profit maximizing output to be $10. I'm sorry, 10 units. How much profit should be earned? Will be earned. So what is profit again? How do we figure out profit? What is the first component of profit? If you want to, if you want to set up that condition by getting the derivative of profit, then that will get you to the price equals marginal cost condition. But in this example that has actual numbers, like what are the components of profits again? Like what's the first part? Revenue minus cost, right? What's revenue? Price times quantity. But yeah, exactly. It's $200. So yeah, and then so we need to get revenue at the profit maximizing level, multiply that by the equilibrium price, which is $20. That gets us our revenue, minus the cost of producing that amount. So minus the cost. So we have to plug in 20 into our cost function to get the cost of producing that, and then subtract that from revenues. So you've got 10 times 20 is 200, minus 5, minus 100. So that's going to get you a profit of $95. All right. So now an important concern with these firms is like, how do they operate if they're operating at a loss? Do they simply shut down, meaning that their profits are negative? Should they just shut down, or is there a point, or is there a condition which allows them to stay in business because it benefits them even if they're operating at an economic loss? And the answer to that is yes. And so we'll go over why that is right now, and then after the break, we'll talk about how that relates to the supply curve for the individual firm. So in some instances, short-run losses are going to be inevitable. Here we'll analyze procedures for minimizing losses in the short run. If losses are sustained in the long run, the best thing for the firm is to exit the industry. All right, so consider first a situation where there are some fixed costs of production. So that means that there's going to be a U-shaped average total cost curve. Suppose the market price, in this case, PE, lies below the average total cost curve, but above the average variable cost curve. So here is our average total cost curve. There's our marginal cost. It crosses it at its minimum. And here is our average variable cost curve. Again, reflecting the average cost of producing attributable to the wages, the variable input, the labor that's being used. So average variable cost, again, moves in the same way as average total cost, but has its minimum before average total cost because, again, average total cost has two forces acting upon it. Even when average variable cost reaches its minimum where marginal cost crosses it, where diminishing returns dominate and start to bring up average variable cost, average total cost will still be pulled down by the spreading effect of the average fixed cost until marginal cost crosses it, at which point diminishing returns then becomes a dominant force for it, and average total cost starts to increase. So the minimum of average total cost happens after the minimum of average variable cost, but both minimums occur when marginal cost crosses them. All right, so suppose that in this case, price lies below the average total cost of production. Price equals marginal cost. That's the profit maximizing level of output for this firm. But at that level of output, the average cost of producing is going to be above the prices being charged. So there's going to be some losses there. These are going to be their revenues, the price times the quantity. This is how much money they're collecting from the market. At that quantity, the average total cost is going to be bigger. So if you multiply the quantity times the average total cost, you're going to get the total cost of producing, which is going to be this big rectangle that includes this extra section, which represents loss to the firm. They are not collecting enough revenues to cover all their costs, and so they are operating at a loss. At this quantity, price exceeds the average variable cost, though. So at that quantity, if we go down to the average variable cost curve, we see the average variable cost is at least less than the price that's being collected in the market. And so the average variable cost of producing times the quantity represents the cost attributable to the labor input, the variable input that is being used to produce. We see that the revenues are covering that completely and that there's some left over. So even though it's incurring losses, the firm should continue to produce in the short run. In the short run, the firm is at least covering their variable costs. What is the difference between average total cost and average variable cost? The difference between average total cost and average variable cost is average fixed cost, right? So this is the average fixed cost of producing times the quantity. That means these two rectangles represent the total fixed cost to the firm, the cost that they have to pay for in the short run while they're in business no matter what. So the firm has fixed costs that would have to be paid even if the firm decided to shut down its operation, represented by this box. If the firm did shut down, then they would have to pay for these entire fixed costs, and their loss would be greater than their loss if they continue operating. So even under this circumstance, where they are operating at a loss, because the price is above the average variable cost of producing, it makes sense for the firm to continue operating at a loss, because at least they're covering some of their fixed costs, and therefore their losses are minimized. So their revenues cover all of the cost of labor and the fixed costs that, again, are represented by this rectangle below the price. All right, let's talk about the decision to shut down, though. There could be a different scenario where the firm is operating a loss and it should shut down, and that's the case where the average variable cost is above the price. So suppose the market price is so low that it lies below the average variable cost. So here's our average variable cost curve. Here is our price. Price equals marginal cost at this point, dictating the optimal level, the profit maximizing level of output. This is how much the firm should produce. At that level, even the average variable costs are above the price. So the revenues aren't even covering the cost of labor. So that's our fixed cost, the difference between average total cost and average variable cost times the quantity. This is our revenue, and therefore this extra box here represents the extra variable costs that are not being covered by the revenue. So again, that's our variable cost, average variable cost times quantity. Again, there's a portion of it that is not being covered by our revenue. Therefore, like this purple box represents the loss, which is greater for the firm because it's continuing to operate than if it were to shut down and simply have to pay the fixed costs. And so suppose instead of producing Q star units of output, the firm decides to shut down. In that case, its losses would equal just the fixed costs. So that light blue box represents the loss if they shut down, whereas if they produce, then they have a bigger loss. And so in this circumstance, the firm should shut down because the average variable cost is above their price. So to summarize, we have demonstrated the following principle: the short-run output decision under perfect competition. To maximize short-run profits, the perfectly competitive firm should produce in the range of increasing marginal cost at the point where price equals marginal cost, provided that the price is greater than or equal to the average variable cost. If price is less than the average variable cost, the firm should shut down its plant to minimize its losses. All right, let's take a break. Let's come back at 8:35.